This video is just a quick rundown of Chapter 5 to cover social reforms in the Progressive Era. Many people did not think that social reform was possible in America during this time due to social Darwinism, the political power of corporations, and the fact that government was dominated by a patronage system. So basically, nominations were given to candidates who were connected to party machines or who could bring in large corporate donations. And being that these corporations really evolved due to industrialization, people did not think that social reform was going to happen. And when you hear the term progressives, do not think of modern day progressives, because progressives back then were very prejudiced against immigrants and African Americans, and many programs that they developed excluded both of these groups of people. So during the Progressive Era, there was limited policy reforms for women. Between 1911 and 1999, the Mother's Pension Movement was developed, and this focused on providing pensions for mothers who were divorced, who were single mothers, or who were widowed mothers. But most of the money went to widowed mothers just because they received the most sympathy. But this program did exclude immigrants because it did have a residency and citizenship requirement. Another piece of legislation that the progressives were able to attain was minimum wage for women in 15 states plus DC in 1925, and the maximum amount of daily work hours in 41 states in 1921. While there were limited policy reforms for women, there were also limited policy reforms for children. The progressives were able to obtain juvenile court so that children were no longer tried as adults, which is extremely important. And then the National Children's Bureau was established in 1912. However, they received very low funding and they were limited to education and social services. So they were not allowed to provide any health services, and they were eventually terminated in 1929 because they were said to have violated states' rights. There were also very little reforms for workers during this time. Workers' comp laws were developed in almost all states by 1920. However, this was an extremely controversial decision and received lots of backlash. There was also very little reforms for the mentally ill. In 1905, there was no aftercare services for the mentally ill after leaving mental hospitals. They were left to fend for themselves, but social workers were eventually employed to follow and assist them upon release. Many reforms were attempted, but failed to assist the mentally ill in community settings. So while there were little reforms for minority groups, there were some very important reforms, such as regulations on the food and drug industry, which placed restrictions on the content and labeling of food and drugs. There were protections for immigrants from their employers due to the fact that 60% of the U.S. labor force was foreign-born. There were protections for women to prevent them from kidnapping for prostitution and human trafficking. There were regulations on immigration to resist and restrict immigration. And then there were reforms for working hours for children and women. There were reforms for working hours of federal employees, and there was housing reforms that mainly affected immigrants.